ironically, having this happen to you as a child, hearing these kinds of things said to you, may make you more likely to become vulnerable to a narcissist than to become a narcissistic person. But I would be willing to bet that for a child to be on the receiving end of really defamatory, cruel language is either going to end them up as a narcissist or as an experiencer of narcissistic abuse. How do you not raise a narcissist? And today we're going to talk about something very specific called extrinsic motivation. So what is this thing called extrinsic motivation? So let me put it to you as a thought of, let's think about people out there, parents out there, who may only care about things like this. Where are you going to go to school someday? Did you get on the right sports team? Oh, sweetie, you got to wear this dress I got you. I spent hours looking for this dress to find something that looks right on you. Isn't Dad's new car amazing? Look at all this new stuff I bought. Look at my retail therapy. Sweetie, do you really need to have dessert every night? When we think about those things, and if your parents ever said things like that to you, drop it in the comments. But healthy people are about their interiors. People on the narcissism spectrum are about their exteriors. And as far as they are concerned, a good exterior can compensate for any level of insecurity or inadequacy. People raised by narcissistic parents, especially grandiose, communal, and self-righteous narcissists, will remember childhoods characterized by how things looked, the house needing to look just so, family photos needing to look just so, celebrations needing to look just so, your appearance looking just so. And with self-righteous narcissistic parents, there may be the exterior element of needing everyone to do things in the rigid way that the parent expected them to, and to live in the lines of how the self-righteous narcissistic parent believes people should live. It's all about how things look. But we can take this a step further into something called intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation and value systems. Intrinsic motivation is about doing something because it feels good for you. Writing a poem because it just feels nice to write a poem or share your emotion, even if nobody ever reads it. Or cooking something just to experiment with a recipe, or you think it might taste good. You aren't doing it for an extrinsic reward. That's what we see in an extrinsic motivational system, which is driven by external rewards or praise from other people. You can guess which one is the narcissist's game. Ding, they are extrinsically motivated. There are researchers out there like Richard Ryan and Tim Kasser who take on issues like extrinsic and intrinsic value systems, and they link it to something really important, which is materialism. Materialism is our drive to acquire or own or just show off our stuff and our achievements. Obviously, all of this is core to narcissism as well. Materialism is an extrinsic value system. Now, narcissistic people are very materialistic because it's an external way to easily get validation and to regulate. Hey, it doesn't matter if your self-esteem sucks as long as you have $800 shoes or a $50 million yacht or a tricked out truck or the latest gadget. The shoes, the yacht, the truck, the gadget, the stuff, all become a way to regulate that self-esteem through the admiration that the world gives or the perception that everyone envies you for the great stuff you have. Now, extrinsic value systems and motivations are linked to greater emptiness, fragility, lower self-esteem, and a greater need for praise and less empathy. Extrinsic values are also associated with being less socially connected, less community-oriented, and less attuned to the needs of others. All of that's starting a lot like narcissism. More materialism, more narcissism. In the Instagram-infused hashtag, look at the brands I am wearing world we are in, all of this can feel like a setup for greater societal narcissism. But what this video is about is, what does this mean for children? Let's face it, there's very few people out there who would say, hey, I'd love it if my children were really materialistic, but I'm seen more than a few unsettling internet images of children wearing designer backpacks costing thousands of dollars or logo festooned designer labels that are mirrors of their parents, when I'm sure they'd be just fine wearing a shirt with their favorite anime character. But modally, I don't think many parents want this for their child. However, the parents' behavior may be quite materialistic. So the children may hear their parents yammering on about their clothes, their cars, their labels, their neighborhoods, or other stuff. The child may observe how much their parents are so concerned about how things look, or may hear their parents' conversations, coveting what other people have, the vacations other people have, you name it. The children themselves may have attention lavished on them for how they look or how they perform. Holiday or birthday gifts may be age-inappropriate high-end goods when the child may have been just fine with Legos or a board game. Now, if parents don't police this extrinsic motivation stuff, we're basically kind of sunk, because really that's more of a family thing. I don't believe personally that extrinsic motivation and extrinsic value systems alone by themselves are a major generator of narcissism. If a child has secure attachments, available and responsive caregivers, compassion, kindness, consistency, validation, then the kid is probably going to have good fundamentals in most cases. And so buying a kid a Gucci backpack or a Chanel sweatshirt, or a parent bragging about their new sports car all the time, that's probably not what's going to make a kid narcissistic. It might make them materialistic and superficial, but not narcissistic. Ultimately, if a child has a solid sense of self and secure attachment, exposure and cultivation to extrinsic motivation may be more likely maybe to result in stuff like entitlement, some privilege, superficiality. There may also be some dents in their empathy and deeper social connection. But like I said, extrinsic motivation is an issue in making narcissism, but it's definitely not a ringer. It really is a difficult era for parents who are raising children who are exposed to the desolation and materialism of social media. And parents in this generation didn't have to grapple with this stuff as children, so they're really trying to raise kids in a landscape that's completely unfamiliar and new. It's really tightrope walking without a net. The proliferation of lifestyle images, branding of human beings, and stuff like billionaire worship makes it tough to work on the intrinsic stuff, because the extrinsic stuff is always clanging in our ears, even if it's not stuff we're interested in. So the question then becomes, what can a parent or caregiver do to manage these issues around extrinsic motivation? Number one, as parents, we have to get our own extrinsic stuff in check. Listen, everybody likes new things from time to time, but maybe shopping is not an optimal weekend activity every weekend. Be mindful of how you talk about shopping, stuff, and image. Be careful you don't fall into snobby critiques because someone's wearing the wrong shoes or wrong clothes or other sorts of lifestyle indicators. The lessons are out there for us to teach, but as parents you may think, well, I'm just getting my kid regular kid stuff or the stuff their friends have. But if they believe that you really value high-end stuff or just stuff in general, it does impact them. Secondly, you need to pay attention to how your child interacts with stuff. If you notice your child doing things only for praise or rewards or external incentives, start modeling better behavior by teaching them about the internal rewards, such as the pleasure in just doing something well, or just enjoying what you do versus always giving them gold stars and screen time as a reward. It's very easy for us as parents to only use external incentives because they work. However, it is quite important to incentivize the just doing something. And that can mean that we need to slow down and engage in the just doing. Art projects, board games, bake a cake, plant a garden, walk the dog. Number 3, as a parent, we've got to stop with the it has to look good of it all. Stop with obsessing over the house being perfect and the drawers being perfectly organized and the clothes being perfect and the pictures being perfect and their activities being perfect and the best tutor and the best ballet class and the best soccer team and the best. All of that appearance focus impacts your child and fosters that sense of extrinsic motivation. Number 4, Definitely, you need to catch your children if if they are disparaging someone for not having the right this or the right that, or for any forms of snobbery or devaluation. Take a minute and look inward to determine if that focus comes from the vibe in the household, and if so, try to change the family culture. If it's not the family culture, it may be something that they have seen peers do. And then it becomes a conversation about not valuing people simply by what they wear or the things they own. Number 5, engage in stories, books, movies, anything that sends the message of inside is important, outside is secondary. These modern parables that you might find in stories and movies are important. Choose ones that are age appropriate, because the fact is, the older they get, the less you are going to be able to shape them in this regard. So start young. Number 6, ensure that conversations about money, stuff, acquisition of stuff, status, are managed at an age-appropriate level, and have conversations about this stuff in a way that's out of their earshot. As a parent, you may care about the right neighborhood or the status thing, but these are not always appropriate conversations for your child to hear. You don't want them to hear that if we have these things, then we're better. It's just not good for them. Number 7, stay on top of their social media usage. TikTok, Instagram, these are platforms that really foster targeted advertising, marketing, brand uptake, and the sense for young people that if I could just look like that and have that or be that, then my life would be good, as well as the relentless social comparison that occurs because of these platforms. Spending time on these sites for young people and adolescents, it's a time suck with little reward, and it definitely reinforces extrinsic motivation. But tread lightly. Instead of turning TikTok or Instagram into the enemy, which is definitely a battle you cannot win, talk to them about it. Let them share with you what they find engaging about these platforms. Let them engage in critical thinking about it. I got to be honest, a lot of adolescents are pretty damn sophisticated, and they do understand how manipulative social media is, and they are able to articulate that. Instead of turning social media into the big bad thing, just help your kids become social media aware. You're more likely to make more meaningful headway in those conversations. Pushing back on materialism doesn't mean that you minimize, enjoying a new piece of clothing you get from time to time. Pushing back on extrinsic motivation is really paying attention to not measuring yourself and others on the basis of external characteristics, or engaging in certain behaviors only for extrinsic rewards. While materialism and extrinsic value systems don't cause narcissism, they definitely set up risk factors like less depth, less empathy, and a sense of self that is too based on the stuff outside of us. And always remember the key message about where narcissism comes from. More and more evidence suggests that it's very much associated with temperament. Child is born with a certain temperament that makes the child almost sort of biologically vulnerable. Then the stuff that happens in the environment is what then heightens the likelihood of that child potentially becoming a narcissistic adult. What it means is that your child who has a different, maybe a much softer, easier to soothe, milder, kinder temperament, exposed to all this extrinsic stuff, may not be as affected by it. But a kid with one of those more difficult, fractious temperaments, with all this extrinsic motivational stuff on top of it, and the reward seeking that's built into those difficult temperaments, that could end up being more of a setup for narcissism. So it's not just one thing, it's many, many pathways coming together. Now, in the 1950s, a psychiatrist named John Bowlby and a psychologist named Mary Ainsworth laid out a developmental model called attachment theory. This model focused on our earliest relationships, typically with parents or other early primary caregivers. They showed that a child needs a solid, secure, consistent relationship with just one solid, safe, secure, and available adult caregiver to set the foundation for normal development. That adult becomes a sort of base camp for the child. And if the child is at all stressed, where do they want to be? They want to be near their safe base. These researchers also focused on understanding how infants reacted to a separation, even a brief separation, from their primary caregiver, or to the moments when their caregiver wasn't readily available. Now, in their definition, a good caregiver is someone who is available, consistent, and responsive. And the child wants to know that the caregiver is close and connected. If a caregiver is not available or responsive, then the child will be anxious and will search their environment or will cry or do something else to call out for the caregiver. If the caregiver does not show up, then the baby will experience despair. Now, I would love to hear though, drop a comment if you ever remember learning about attachment, maybe in a psychology class, maybe in other things that you've read. It'd be interesting to know how many of us already know about this idea of attachment theory. Now, it's normal for young children to become upset when their caregiver leaves. It's also normal for a child to be calmed down rather quickly by that caregiver when they return. There is lots of information out there on attachment theory if you want to learn more. For example, about something called the strange situation experiment, etc. It's really interesting stuff. You may have learned about it in school. But suffice it to say, a child, all children, need a consistent, safe person in their lives to develop a healthy sense of self and a healthy psychological development. Bowlby and Ainsworth and other researchers subsequent to them describe different attachment styles, including a secure attachment, anxious attachment, and avoidant attachment. Since then, others have also added what's called the disorganized attachment style. Now, secure attachment is what we see when we see a child who is a little sad when their parent leaves, but then they're soothed by whomever the other caregivers might be. It might be a babysitter or a teacher. And then when the parent comes back to them, the child is quickly soothed by their parent's return. The anxious attachment style is when the child becomes extremely rattled and upset when the parent departs. And it's hard to soothe the child even when the parent comes back. In the anxious attachment style, the child will go back and forth between wanting to be comforted and then wanting to punish the parent for leaving. Now, for those of you dealing with narcissistic relationships in adulthood, does that sound familiar? The push-pull of them, wanting you to reassure them and then wanting to punish you? Definitely drop in a comment if you've seen that kind of anxious attachment style play out in adulthood. Now, finally, in the avoidant attachment pattern, children do not get too upset when the parent leaves. And when their parent returns, they actively avoid them. Now, researchers Cynthia Hazan and Philip Shaver have also talked about adult attachment styles. Securely attached adults are sad when they have to say goodbye to their loved ones or partners, especially to their partners. And then they're genuinely happy and elevated when they come back together with their partner. Avoidant adults, they don't really care that much about close relationships. And they don't want to be dependent or don't really care about other people. So they don't care about goodbye and they don't really care about hello. But when it comes to narcissistic relationships, it really appears to relate most closely to how Shaver and Hazan write about anxiously attached adults. Anxiously attached adults are always worried that other people do not love them and become frustrated when their needs are not met. People who are narcissistic most often look anxiously attached. They are always worried that whomever they proclaim to love will not return their love, and they get rageful when their needs are not met. So then comes that punitive part. In a way, the anxiously attached adult mirrors their punitive anger at their caregiver from childhood, right? They're still mad about that. They take it out in the adult relationship. The anxiously attached adult is often inconsistent, cold, rejecting, and unempathic with their partners, and they're upset when their needs don't get met. This anxious attachment style can also sort of result in sort of an obsessive style that is very much a signature of the narcissistic relationship. Narcissistic folks are caught in a constant push-pull in their relationships, and that's why we see the constant and dramatic arguments, breaking up and getting back together. Lots of anxiety, begging the partner to come back, the hoovering. It's that anxious attachment come to life in its adult form. And that's really what a lot of narcissistic relationships look like. In a lot of the theoretical research on adult narcissism, there is definitely the suggestion that many, if not most, narcissistic people have an anxious attachment style. Lots of volatility. They definitely don't do well with goodbyes. They also don't do well with hellos, especially if there's been a separation. In a way, the narcissistic adult is still the angry child that can't believe that you left home, even if it's just to go to work, right? And there's lots of punitive acting out in the relationship. That means that people who do therapy with narcissistic people try to address that anxious attachment by being consistently available at that session time, right? The consistent available parent. Now, narcissistic clients often try to take advantage of that. They will frequently try to touch base with or even bother the therapist in between sessions. They want to have access to them all the time. So the work becomes letting the client know, I am here for you every week at this time. This is your time. But I can't be there for you all the time throughout the week. Setting that boundary and setting the consistency basically alongside the healthy boundaries they never had. None of this really ever works with a narcissistic client, which is actually why narcissistic clients often burn therapists out. The therapist keeps setting boundaries, the client keeps claiming to have emergencies, or they keep sending messages or communications to the therapist keeps setting higher boundaries, and either the client gets frustrated that they cannot always use the therapist as a pacifier, and then they drop out of therapy, or the therapist burns out altogether and either drops the client or, in some cases, literally stops being a therapist. So a parent doesn't really have the same option, but you could see the effect that that child might have had on a parent as well. Now, where do anxious attachments come from? Now, lots of places. Unavailable caregivers in childhood, and this can be for such a wide range of reasons. Perhaps the caregivers are actually gone and there is no good substitute. It could be due to chaos in the household. Parents who are preoccupied with stressors. Parents who are egocentric. Parents who are just immersed in their own lives and interests and are maybe perhaps narcissistic themselves and don't want to be bothered with children. The child, in these cases, where there's inconsistent parents, never gets that secure base to return to, never learns to feel safe and secure in the world, and may feel a constant sense of being left or abandoned, and then has difficulty regulating or soothing themselves. And this extends into adult relationships. And in adult relationships, there can be lots of anxiety about abandonment, a neediness or a clinginess, and rage at the partner because of this anxiety, and to punish them for not being available to them all the time. Now, here's an interesting paradox. When people recognize that anxious attachment is a big part of what may underlie adult narcissistic styles, becomes sort of an interesting setup for cognitive dissonance for the person who's in the relationship with the narcissistic person, because then the rescuer hat goes on. And the belief is that if I am always there for them, and I am now the new consistent parent, and I'm available, and I'm loving, then I can fix their anxious attachment. Nope, not going to happen. You can't, and frankly, it's not your job. It's not your place or need as a partner to reparent your partner. Their work is to do the hard work of therapy and to work through this in therapy, as uncomfortable as it may be. You are not their abandoning, unavailable parent, and nothing you can say or do is going to change that. And as you can see, if you fall into this trauma-bonded, I am going to fix this attachment issue for you role, you, in essence, have, instead of being a partner, really become the parent of a tantruming, dysregulated child, again, instead of being an adult partner to another adult. Now, the attachment origin model of narcissism is one of the more robust and likely useful explanatory models. It explains why we see narcissistic personality across all groups, all over the world, and across even socioeconomic groups. For example, there may be different reasons why a wealthy parent is not available to a child compared to why a person of fewer economic resources may not be available to a child, but the child experiences it the same way, and it can have similar impacts. It also explains the challenges that we see that narcissistic people have with both intimacy and empathy. It explains all of the challenges with dysregulation and the incapacity to engage in something called self-soothing. It explains the abandonment fears and the anger that narcissistic people often display, not just when you say goodbye, but even when you reconnect. It explains the vindictiveness and the punitiveness of these relationships. So it's a theory that really does kind of reach into all the kinds of corners of narcissism and makes sense of a lot of it. So let's say you're a parent still raising a child and you don't want to raise a narcissistic child. What do? Try to be consistent, available, responsive, and present. Be that secure base for your child. The younger and the more consistently this happens, the better. As I said, you are base camp and the safe place that lets the child get more bold and courageous with regard to exploring their world. Number 2, you got to put down the devices and just be with them. You got to learn to reflect their emotions. Have good routines around goodbyes and hellos. Goodbyes and hellos for children can be rather challenging and chaotic moments for a child. Whatever you do, you can have a song, you can have a routine, you can have a little pinky handshake, and that you can then harness at the time that you can use at the time of hello and of goodbye to make those sort of soothing times. Make those reunions very present, right? It's easy to say, okay, hey, it's good to see you again. All right, let's get in the car. Be present at hello, be present at goodbye, but have that hello routine and that goodbye routine. Be aware of your own attachment style and attachment issues, as those are going to play a role in how you are present with your own child. For example, an anxiously attached parent may tend to be a little bit more hovery and not allow their child enough leeway to safely explore. Or an anxiously attached parent may portray the world to be a dangerous place to a child because of their own anxieties. Number 5, remember that it only takes one securely attached person in a child's life to help them feel securely attached. You may be concerned because you have a difficult or a narcissistic co-parent. It's okay. A child just needs one secure base. It's not obviously optimal for a child to have a negating parent, but in those early years, if you are able to be that for your child as their one good solid caregiver, you may be good. Your child will probably still grapple with anxiety from having a narcissistic parent, but you still could have given them that secure base. I'd love to hear, is there anything else you've done to try to avoid raising a narcissistic child, especially when you think about it in terms of attachment, please leave a comment and let us know. As a child gets older, it does get a little harder to shift the course of attachment. A lot of this stuff gets set in early childhood, but always remember that brains are neuroplastic. They can change. And so I'm a believer that it is never too late to get good attachment practices into place as a parent. These attachment issues are a pillar of the origin of narcissism, and many of us can see how our own attachment styles very much impact us in adulthood. I mean, listen, would that we lived in a world of all full of securely attached people. It would be harmonious and kind and balanced and less violent. But here's the rub, gang. That is not the world that we live in. I hope all of this sheds some light on attachment and on narcissism. But I also want to make one other point. It's interesting. There's been some emails and comments like saying, I listen to these videos, but sometimes I'm worried, are you blaming the parents for their narcissistic children? No. The fact is, I have seen parents who have more than one child, 2, 3, 4 kids. One kid in the family is really narcissistic, and they have 3 really nice kids who are empathic and kind and compassionate. So the fact of the matter is, as you remember from other videos in this series, there's also that temperamental piece, that genetic part of personality. We're still learning about the genetics of narcissism. We're still learning about the origins of it. While obviously we want to give our kids the best leg up in terms of giving them healthy personalities, but I myself have worked with families where there have been 2 absolutely devoted, available, present parents, where the child, by all best reports, had a secure attachment. And then I'm working with the family, and they have adult children who are ragingly narcissistic, and they did a good job as parents. So please know that this is not meant to say, oh, that reason my kid's narcissistic is I was not a secure caregiver. You may very well have been. There may have been other disruptions. You may have had a malignant narcissistic spouse or a difficult narcissistic spouse, which also made it harder. Temperament may have played a role. So please understand, in more cases than not, every kid in the family is not narcissistic. It's one, and there are others that are healthy. We still are trying to figure out there are no absolutes when it comes to human development. So let's talk a little bit about the role of shame and humiliation. Now, this could be a short video on how to raise kids. Don't use shame and humiliation, because shame and humiliation are not going to be leading any parenting guidebook on what anyone would consider to be good techniques for parenting. But yet, shame and humiliation are something that have impacted the experience of so many children's early lives. It's unfortunate, but it's true. And this is often, the shame and humiliation are often a projection from parents who are grappling with their own stuff and projecting their own shame onto their children. I don't care what the psychological dynamics are, it doesn't make it okay. Now, someone named Dr. Alexander Lowen, who has written books on narcissism, is someone who in about the last 20 years has suggested that the development of narcissism may trace back to shame and humiliation during childhood and is magnified by parents who are controlling and emotionally cold or distant. Now, Dr. Lowen was specifically talking about parents who would do things like give sort of disproportionate punishments to a child based on their transgression, or they would chronically criticize, invalidate, or shame the child for just about anything the child would do. Elbows on the table or messy room, for their grades, for their tears, for their worries. So then childhood becomes a chronic shame and humiliation experience. Seeing the parent always overpower themselves as a child, and also overpowering everyone else in the room, a child in that situation then learns that power is the safest way to manage relationships, and that feelings are weakness, and that not succeeding is weakness. Lowen believes that this may relate to his clinical observation that children who go on to become narcissistic adults are more likely to be rebellious, particularly during adolescence. Lowen sees rebellion as a sort of means of manipulation and a way for a child or an adolescent to gain power in a family system that is so characterized by shame. Shame is a, if not the, core dynamic that we see in the narcissistic personality. And that shame can get fostered by developmental environments that are shaming or humiliating or that focus only on the child's sort of exterior behavior and focus on them from like a place of sort of a deficit, telling the kid, oh, there you go again, you screwed that up again, as well as shaming other features of the child's appearance or their abilities, or even shaming them for being somewhat similar to like a difficult family member, like saying, oh, you're just like that, you're drunk of a father. Again, more shaming. Now, all of that gets internalized into a deep-seated sense of inadequacy and insecurity. All of that has nowhere to go. The child's emotion has been shamed. And so the child then learns, okay, my internal world isn't worth anything, so I'm going to work on the exterior stuff. And they build up stuff like grandiosity, grandiose defenses, entitlement, combativeness, all to keep their sense of insecurity and their sense of powerlessness in check. And then, as the child who grew up with so much shame and humiliation, as they get older, and anything comes up that activates those feelings of inadequacy or insecurity, also at those times their shame gets activated. And what does the narcissistic adolescent and adult do? They react against the person who may have evoked that shame. Rage will often follow, and then they may feel shame that they showed that rage. Then they'll feel more rage and more shame and more rage, and it's sort of an endless cycle. And this is why you will see the cycle in adults with narcissistic or other antagonistic personalities who will do that. They'll throw that terrible ragey tantrum. They will then read the ugly emails or texts they sent in the morning. They'll sort of pseudo-apologize for them. They'll recognize it wasn't a good look. They'll blame you because it was your behavior that led them to send those messages. And the shame will be driving all of that. And then they'll get ragey again because you evoke shame in them. You can't win at this game with them. They're in a constant state of shame or rage or getting ready for it again. Now, shame can also be driven societally or by a community. For example, a person who may have grown up with less money or fewer resources, or may have grown up in, I don't know, a more rundown house than other people in their community. They may have felt a sense of inadequacy and shame because of that, especially if they were sort of, treated badly in that town for that. There are other societal patterns, such as discrimination, which can also foster shame. We also live in a world in which inadequacies that are the way they're framed by social media, none of us are enough on social media, right? Those can also cultivate a sense of shame and inadequacy. Another example would be anyone who's ever had any kind of a learning issue or any other behavioral issues in school where they may have felt that they were behind from their peers or different from their peers, or that may just not have excelled in traditional learning environments. School can be a place that on a daily basis for a child would bring up that sense of shame, inadequacy, and insecurity. So if you're a parent and you're saying, I do not want to raise a narcissistic child, what can you do? Number one, never ever use shame as a means of addressing behavior or communication with your child. It is not good for them. It is not good for you. And to shame a child will never result in any kind of sustainable or meaningful behavioral change or improvement. If a child's behavior is an issue, address the behavior. Shaming or humiliating the child have no place in parenting. Number two, you don't want to compare your child to other children, not your own, not others. Because as you can imagine, that is certainly going to foster a sense of shame or inadequacy about not measuring up. It's a setup for the child to always feel that they need to look outside of themselves and to compare themselves instead of being able to internally manage their sense of who they are. Number three, never mock or ridicule or belittle or use any form of defamatory language against a child. Now, this should be human being 101, but so many parents do it, and so many people grew up with it happening to them. Ironically, having this happen to you as a child, hearing these kinds of things said to you, may make you more likely to become vulnerable to a narcissist than to become a narcissistic person. But I would be willing to bet that for a child to be on the receiving end of really defamatory, cruel language is either going to end them up as a narcissist or as an experiencer of narcissistic abuse. There really isn't a healthy path forward from that. Number 4, remain aware of how your child's school manages comparison between children and how your child's school is able to talk about both strengths and deficits. A child who regularly feels shamed and ridiculed and humiliated at school can be really rendered quite vulnerable by those exposures, even if things are supportive at home. And I ask you who are watching, can you think of other ways for parents to make sure that they don't foster a sense of shame in their children? Would love to hear about them. Please drop them in the comments below, because it's something that everyone can learn from. Now, the difficult thing, frankly, about this entire series of how to not raise a narcissist, and it's something I've reiterated throughout this series, is interestingly that the childhood risk factors for developing a narcissistic personality are interestingly quite similar to the risk factors for being vulnerable to narcissistic abuse. It's really always it's important to remember that narcissism is most likely, the origin of the narcissistic personality is likely a byproduct or a combination of both biological temperament and environmental exposure. And for that reason, it's likely the case that the parent, just the straight developmental parenting and environmental exposures are going to be much more likely to be associated with the development of a narcissistic personality in people who have the biological personality, the temperament. And while those who don't have that that difficult temperament will be more, they'll be the ones to go on to experience anxiety, self-doubt, and a greater vulnerability to narcissistic people when they grow up. That biological temperament, that difficult temperament in childhood, seems to be the tipping point. So I want to begin with this. I love you. Common sentence. I love you is supposed to be a complete sentence. Not I love you if, or I love you when, especially when you say it to a child. Now, I love you, telling someone I love you, doesn't mean that you necessarily approve of a person's behavior. You can say, I love you, your behavior isn't acceptable, and I love you. But when we're talking about children, a child needs to know that they're loved, and then at the same time, they learn that recognize that perhaps their behavior is unacceptable. And for parents, it's a real balancing act to do both, but it's something we all need and most of us did not get. All of us are lovable. Most of us make mistakes. All of us make mistakes. And we remain lovable. Children need to know they are loved, and yet most of them hear, I love you, when you, I love you, if. So this series on how to or how not to raise a narcissist really gets at a lot of the potential origins of narcissism. There is no one singular pathway, and this series is meant to show the many, many different multi-determined ways we land at this not so pleasant place of narcissism. Before I continue with this, please consider subscribing to this channel. It means a lot to me. It means all this work is actually reaching people, helps this channel grow and reach more people, which actually benefits all of us. The more people who get narcissism, the more people are going to know how to manage it and hopefully not enable it. And if you like it, listen to it. Give it that thumbs up, because a little validation goes a long way for me. Now, when love is really conditional, this puts a person at risk, potentially, for developing a narcissistic personality. So like all of these various pathways of origin we're talking about in this series, Many of you are thinking, okay, that's interesting, Dr. Ramani. I got nothing but conditional love when I was growing up. The I love you when or the I love you if. And now you reflect on the fact that you're actually quite empathic and that you got harmed by the narcissistic folks. And by the way, I think far more of us got conditional love than unconditional love. Unconditional love, sadly, is a pretty rare space. So none of these pathways to narcissism are absolutes. They're risk factors. Some of these things can happen to people. They wind up narcissistic in adulthood. Some of these things happen to people and they actually end up being vulnerable to the narcissist. In fact, I do believe that people who miss out on unconditional love are actually at risk for being harmed by narcissistic relationships in adulthood. But let's talk a little bit about unconditional love and conditional love and how this may play out in the development of narcissism. Now, this concept of unconditional love is actually originally called unconditional regard, and it comes from the work of humanistic theorists such as Carl Rogers. Now, folks who use this humanistic model have a very positive view of human nature. In fact, I would say that most humanists would not like what I have to say about narcissism, since it isn't very nice or very positive. A humanist would actually argue that a narcissistic person probably had too many what are called conditions of worth placed on them. So you may be wondering, what's a condition of worth? A condition of worth is a condition, it's this idea that in order to be deemed worthy or lovable, a person has to earn love by meeting those conditions. For example, by doing what another person wants, or being what another person wants, or giving another person what they want. You have to earn it, right? So thus, the person's sense of self ends up getting shaped by what the world wants for them and wants from them, rather than developing as someone whose authentic, genuine self is enough. Now, it would be interesting to see if you want to drop a comment, if this is relevant to you, if looking back, you were able to identify relationships in which other people placed conditions on your worth. Now, in the humanistic model, all human beings are viewed as having the potential for something called self-actualization. Now, self-actualization is hot. Consider self-actualization to be the very top, the summit of the psychological mountain. And to get there means that a person has to be authentic, fully formed, deeply genuine, empathic, comfortable in your own skin, and to recognize yourself as worthy of love. Not in an immature manner, but that you recognize your own sense of self-worth and have no need to dominate anyone with any of that. To be capable of, people who are self-actualized are capable of giving unconditional regard and are aware of their strengths and vulnerabilities. Personally, I actually believe that the opposite of narcissism is self-actualization. So if we use these humanistic theories, the argument could be made that narcissistic adults may very well have had conditions of worth placed on them as children. They learned and experienced that love was conditional. You get loved only if you get grades. You only get loved if you do what the parent wants, look the way the parent wants, make the family look good. And here is where intergenerational cycles come into play. The more narcissistic a parent is, the more conditional they tend to be in all relationships, including with their own children. And the more likely they are to raise either children who are narcissistic or children who are very vulnerable to the manipulation of narcissistic people. So ultimately, conditional love, being told I only love you under certain conditions, doesn't get anyone to a good place. Now, the challenge for narcissistic adults is the need to constantly look to the outside world to regulate, to get feedback, to at some level almost confirm that they exist. This is it's a core issue for narcissistic people, and it magnifies their vulnerability, their shame, and their rage. So it makes sense that getting the message of conditional worth or conditional love early in life for a person who goes on to become narcissistic was a real setup for this. As I said, it tends to be a fork in the road. Some people who experience these conditions of worth, which, like I said, is probably most of us, tend to feel anxious. We tend not to fully possess our sense of worth, and we can be vulnerable to self-devaluation and invalidating ourselves, and we can be vulnerable to narcissists. While other people who get conditional love are at risk for relying on the external regulation style that is seen in narcissism. Now, unconditional positive regard, just being loved, leaves a child feeling secure, with a well-developed sense of self and the ability to withstand and regulate frustrations such as disappointment and failure without falling down and feeling like, oh, I failed, so now I'm not lovable. So upon hearing all of this, you may be wondering, what can a parent do, or anyone who is with young children? Number one, never tell them you would love them if, or love them when, or I love you but. Just I love you. Stop. The child needs to experience love free from any conditional setup. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't call them out on their behavior or ever voice disapproval. If they are behaving badly, then that gets addressed. But it's never because they're behaving badly that you say, well, I don't love you anymore. Love should not be contingent on behavior. We can love a person and step away from them. Those are two different issues. Number two, be clear on the difference between your child and the behavior. When we call a child out, it should be on the behavior, not saying to them, oh, you're such a bad kid, but rather, it's not okay to hit your sister. The first statement, oh, you're such a bad kid, invalidates the entire child. The second statement, focusing on them hitting their sibling, helps the child see that a behavior is a problem. It's a fine point, but it's an important one. Number three, and this is a theme from other videos in this series, yes, as parents, we want to celebrate our children's accomplishments and the things that they are good at. But don't leave them feeling that that's the only thing interesting or lovable about them. Get to know and appreciate or understand everything about them. Games they like, interests they have, things they collect, shows they want to watch, people they know, opinions they hold, feelings they have, all of that. Show an interest in the whole child. That helps them build up that strong internal resolve, so they're less externally reliant and then less likely to become narcissistic. Number four, be careful with how you joke with them. We sometimes think, oh, they know I don't mean it when I say these things. No, they don't know that. When you say, oh, if you don't go empty that dishwasher or you don't go set the table, I'm going to love you a little less. Ha ha ha. Maybe you can get away with that once. But even if you have a dark sense of humor, don't play with that in someone's childhood. Wait until adulthood and they have a fully formed sense of self and a sense that they're lovable. And then if you want to say, I may not love you unless you empty that dishwasher, you'd like to think at that point they could withstand it, but not when they're a child. Number five, try to watch how you talk about regrets about your own life with your child. For example, things like, if only I had waited to have you later, my life would have been a lot easier. Listen, that may be absolutely true, but share those thoughts and musings with your friends, therapist, anyone but them. In fact, this may even be a meaningful conversation when your child is an adult. But these kinds of musings on the different choices you could have made in your life that involve them can feel very much like a conditional space to them, and may leave them wondering if your life would have been better or easier or whatever without them. Children often blame themselves, or typically blame themselves, for everything, including any setbacks that you have. So please drop a comment if anything I've said here sort of make sense to you in sort of understanding what a parent can do, or anyone, teachers, anyone else who is involved in the lives of younger children, to make sure a child feels unconditionally loved. Now, even as Carl Rogers and other humanistic folks wrote this stuff, they knew that at some level it was aspirational. None of us get any of this right every time. I have made every mistake many times on this list myself. The issue is how often, how pervasive. The goal is for us as parents to catch it. The fact is that most of us didn't get unconditional love in childhood, and most of us don't get it in adulthood when relationships become even more transactional and more conditional. Conditions of worth and conditional regard, when they happen enough, do not end up getting anyone into a good place. Either they are a setup for narcissism or for the vulnerabilities that make us more malleable and manipulatable by the narcissistic folks out there. So none of these are particularly good destinations. So to avoid these traps around conditional love with children, as a parent, it really is about mindfulness. We have to pay attention to everything we say or do. We have to pay attention to our language, to how we are with them, to be present with them. And frankly, the same rules apply in adulthood and adult relationships. We can do our very best to try to be unconditional in those relationships as well. So these conditions of worth always take us down unhealthy pathways. And if you're in the process of raising children, please catch it. And even if it's with other adults, there is a power to knowing this, because I think that even in adulthood, there's extraordinary possibilities when people feel unconditionally loved. I'm also going to throw one other kind of comment out there, which is this idea of self-actualization, because I know more than a few are thinking, oh, I want to get to the top of that mountain. That sounds like it sounds really cool up there at self-actualization. It's a journey. It's never a place. Like, you don't get to self-actualization and pull up a lounge chair and put your feet up. It's a daily commitment to that. I got to tell you, in my whole life, I think I've probably met 2, maybe 3 self-actualized people, and it's just like a perfect spring day when you're with them. They're so on it, and they're very different kinds of people. Most of them were older, and I do think that there's something about the journey of life that gets someone there, but I'd have to say the word there is serenity. And we really get there by doing the work. And that work may be in therapy. It might be the work that comes from meditation. It really, really, though, comes from pulling ourselves away from all of these conditions of worth, understanding who we are in the world, and in many ways, breaking ourselves from societal messages that tell us we have to own this, we have to do this, that our value comes from where we live and what we drive and what we wear and all of that. That's a really, really tough mountain to climb. It's aspirational, and like I said, sometimes we get there and we get pulled back. We get there, we get pulled back. But I think it is possible for all people. It also means that you self-actualize, you leave people behind. It really is a journey to getting to this place, and to get to that place, you do have to remove the voices in your life that are full of conditions, who are telling you that in their subtle ways that you're not enough, and who may not want you to leave them behind. So self-actualization ain't an easy trip, but for those of you who are interested in it, please read the work of Carl Rogers, because he really gets into it. And if any of you get there, please send a postcard from self-actualization, because I'd love to hear how that feels. I ain't near it yet. And if you like this video, self-actualized or not, please give me a thumbs up. And as always, tune in, subscribe, and look forward to giving you more content tomorrow.